Hello and welcome to Penguin Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. Today we'll be chatting about one of the most classic of novels, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I'd like to welcome Sarah Burns, President of the Australian Bronte Association, well-known book blogger of readmeblogsite.net and committee member of the Dickens Society Louise Owens, and committee member of the Dickens Society Jeff Usher, and book lover Fred Taylor. And of course, we'd also like to welcome back book club members watching our hangout on air. And don't forget to pop your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to get to them during the hangout. And now to the book. A 6-year-old boy named Pip lives on the English marshes with his sister and her husband Joe. And on Christmas Eve, Pip meets a scary escaped convict in a churchyard. And he steals food from his sister so that the convict won't starve. Soon after, in apparently unrelated events, Pip gets asked to play at Miss Havisham. Her mansion is covered in moss. She still wears the wedding dress she was wearing when she was jilted at the altar decades ago, and the whole place is crawling with decay. And here he meets Estella, Miss Havisham's adopted daughter. Estella is cold and snobby, but Pip is mesmerized by her. As the story moves on, Pip comes into his fortune by means of a mysterious and undisclosed benefactor. Says goodbye to his family and heads to London to become a gentleman. Obsessed with Estella and imagining Miss Havisham gave him his great expectations to rise him to her level, Pip moves to London and leaves behind all his friends and family. The story is really complex and has many twists and turns which I won't be able to summarise neatly here, but we are led to discover through many adventures and happenings that the old convict was actually the benefactor of his great wealth and not Miss Havisham. I would like now, just before we begin our discussion, to welcome Jeff to do a reading for us before we begin. To me, this passage is, I think, one of my favourite literary moments of reading a book. So I hope you all enjoy it. And this is when Pip first meets Miss Havisham.
And he's met Estella, and they sit down to play cards. It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch and the clock, a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewel exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing table again and saw that the shoe upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent and saw that the silk stocking on it, once white, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale, decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards, the frillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthy paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen. But I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. "He calls the knaves jacks, this boy," said Estella with disdain, before our first game was out. "And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots." I'd never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt. I misdealt, as was only natural, when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy labouring boy. "You say nothing of her," remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. "She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her?" "I don't like to say," I stammered. "Tell me in my ear," said Miss Havisham, bending down. "I think she is very proud," I replied in a whisper. "Anything else?" "I think she is very pretty." "Anything else?" "I think she is very insulting." She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. "Anything else?" I think I should like to go home and never see her again, though she is so pretty. I am not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now. You shall go soon, said Miss Havisham aloud. Play the game out. Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all the things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift it up again. Her chest had dropped so that she stooped, and her voice had dropped so that she spoke low and with a dead lull upon her. Altogether, she had the appearance of having dropped, body and soul, within and without, under the weight of a crushing blow.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I remember reading that passage and actually stopping and just having to read it again when I first read Great Expectations. So I'd love to ask each one of you, because this book has extraordinary characters in it. Who is your favourite character? Not necessarily a character you might like, but certainly who is your favourite character? Fred, do you want to start us off?
You're right. There are some fabulous characters in this book. It's actually really hard to pick because they're all incredibly unique, very, very interesting in terms of how Dickens has put them together. But if I had to pick, I'd probably have to say Miss Havisham, because it's just such an enigmatic character, and I've just never, I can't really recall a character quite like her. Someone who's just so strange. It made me, when I was reading it, feel almost uncomfortable in a lot of those passages, and I thought it was incredibly well written, her character.
That's a great one. Actually, I have a little strange fact. Apparently, the woman who inspired Dickens, the character Miss Havisham, is buried in a cemetery in Newtown here in Sydney. So that's a famous little gravesite there for Dickens fans. But Louise, who's your favourite character?
Wow. Well, I'm glad you did say, and you don't necessarily have to like them, because I would have to agree with Fred. I just found Miss Havisham fascinating. I read Great Expectations by Year 7 English teacher who used to sit on the edge of the desk and have us all spellbound. And even when I reread Great Expectations now, I can hear her voice doing the Miss Havisham, and it's freaky. I mean, I'd never come across a character like that, and I certainly remember all the bits about her, and that wedding cake and those clothes and the clocks that had stopped. I was spellbound. I had never heard of a character. It did make me think, what kind of an author thinks up something like that? You know, what would have inspired him? But so I'd have to say Miss Havisham. But Pip comes a close second because of his growth. You know, he comes from a really humble childhood. He has these great expectations, and he has kind of invented what these great expectations may be. And then he's obviously stunned when he finds out who his benefactor is, and then he grows a bit more. So I'd say Miss Havisham, seeing that I don't have to like the character, and Pip would be the next, closely followed by Pip.
Nice. Sarah, who's your favourite?
Well, Miss Havisham, Pip and Estella are the memorable ones. I mean, they're the ones I remember from my childhood, from the films and from the book. But reading the book more recently and all the films and TV programs, I quite like Joe Gargery. I think he's a good... he's very simple, but he's a good person. There's that lovely scene when he and Pip are out on the marshes with the soldiers when they recapture Magwitch, and he doesn't begrudge Magwitch taking the pie, even though he didn't take it. But he said, well, we wouldn't want you to starve, and I think that's a really important thing. The values that Pip had. He didn't have much, but he had good values from Joe, not the sister, and a good place to start. And Joe's the one who saves him in the end. He looks after him and pays his debts after he's been ashamed. Yeah. So I think he's a very good person, and I like him.
What about yourself, Jeff? Who's your favourite character?
Sarah got in ahead of me. I reckon Joe is wonderful, and particularly the way he gets himself so tied in knots when he's trying to speak formally.
Yeah.
Just cannot get himself out of it. And the scene when he arrives in London and he's dressed to the nines in clothes that just don't fit him and in which he's uncomfortable, and he's just so awkward and out of place, and he understands Pip's embarrassment, and he gets himself out of the place. He's just, I think, an absolutely straight, humble, ordinary, good, honest person. And thank goodness he ends up marrying Biddy at the end. That one critic says they deserved each other, Joe and Biddy. Jaggers would come a close second for me as an interesting character. The manipulating lawyer who, is he evil? No, he's not. But he's doing a fairly difficult job in very unpleasant circumstances, and finding a way through. And the way he puts the case to you, Mr. Pip. But Joe, I think, wins hands down for me as the favourite character.
There's this strange cruelty with Jaggers, isn't there, when he presents his maid with her cut wrists, and so he almost delights in Pip's discomfort at not knowing who his benefactor is, and almost delights in sort of manoeuvring him to think it is Miss Havisham.
Yeah.
He's the connecting one with all of them, if you think. He's the one that placed Estella with Miss Havisham. He's the one that has taken in Magwitch's wife. There's all these. He's the connecting one. He's a very clever man.
And always able to maintain his professional discretion, confidentiality.
That's right.
Mm.
Yes, he's cool but very trustworthy. And a real, I guess, big theme of this book is the social costs. We see it sort of littered throughout, and certainly Pip's great expectations are all about climbing that social ladder. What do we think about this? Is that the most important theme of the novel?
Well, it is important, but I don't know. I think there's lots of things. His expectation also was Estella, and that was disappointed. It's what you do with what you're given too.
Yeah.
In some ways, sorry, go on, Louise.
I think it's really interesting the way that Dickens introduces us to Joe and Pip's world, and we get we're quite comfortable with that. And then we meet this Miss Havisham world, and all of a sudden Pip questions everything about his life. And I think that is a really clever technique that he kind of, it's like a great big wave. Wow, we're surprised. Pip's surprised. It's a really good contrast. So, yeah, it is a strong thing. And then, of course, Pip's expectations, and then, as we talked about before, when he finds out it is Magwitch, his disappointment. But, yeah, it is a strong theme.
Is that the turning point of the novel, when he finds out whose benefactor is?
I think he's made some assumptions, and we as readers do too, until that comes out, and you look at things differently. What was Miss Havisham's role? What was she trying to do? How does Jaggers fit in? It's all a bit of a red herring, really.
You actually thought that Miss Havisham was the one, that when you first read it, the benefactress.
Yes. And nobody says it does anything to say that's not the case. He's sort of, oh, no, we're not saying that. You can't say anything, but it's confidential.
Yeah.
And Miss Havisham herself plays along with it and almost encourages Pip to believe it's her, because she keeps it such a secret. I understand you have great expectations, Pip.
Yes, and I've seen Jaggers.
She doesn't know where they've come from.
Yeah.
But then when it's revealed that it's actually Magwitch, he seems to regret it almost because he's become somewhat estranged to Joe and to Biddy, and he's almost acted above them, and then he's come to realise full circle that actually things aren't quite what they seem. So that was an interesting twist, I thought, as well.
In a sense, the fortune is tainted.
Mm.
I remember going back through the book thinking, oh, how did I get it so wrong? And I kept rereading pages and think, but he said, and then you read it and think, oh, but that could have actually, I read into that. But of course, that's what Dickens wanted us to be doing.
And of course, his greatest disappointment was the fact that if it wasn't Miss Havisham, then that meant she wasn't setting him up to marry Estella. Which was yeah.
Which just makes Miss Havisham all the more an awful character.
But it's interesting that Estella comes from humble beginnings too. She comes across as this very privileged little girl because that's what the whole performance is and what she's been given, and her expectations and her outlook on, or her future is all set up. But she's actually come from convict.
Mm.
Yeah.
Both parents.
Both of them. Yes.
It has a lot in common with Pip in some ways, but it's interesting the influence of Joe in comparison to Miss Havisham, how their lives have been sort of very differently set out.
Yeah.
Miss Havisham had an agenda, didn't she? Her heart had been broken, and she was teaching Estella how to break hearts herself.
Mm.
She kind of had great expectations for Estella.
Yes. And that's the interesting thing. It's not just Pip who has great expectations, is it, in this novel? There's quite a few different characters.
All the hangers on.
We see Magwitch had great expectations for Pip. I think that's definitely one of them. Don't know what Jagger's motives are.
Yeah.
There are actually two endings to Great Expectations. There's the official version in which Pip and Estella are reunited in the garden, and then there's the earlier version in which they merely speak briefly on the street and they go their separate ways. And when they're in the garden, it's almost alluded that they will never part. Which version do you prefer, the happy ending or the, I guess, almost the more realistic ending?
I'm not sure. The happy one, it just seems like a natural, that they've been apart and they've come together, that they were meant to be. But the other one, they were never meant to be. And the fact that that's the one that Dickens wrote first. Some people say that was his cruelty. He didn't want it to have a happy ending. But I think they're both very interesting.
I think the very fact that there are two endings and that there are letters surviving between Dickens and his peers about the discussions of the benefits of the different endings is fascinating in itself. That must be really interesting because obviously it was written as serial, people would get installments. And people did have expectations maybe of the ending indeed. So I think it was really interesting that it was kind of almost debated at the time of what this ending should be, which is a bit of an insight into an author and his readership.
Mm.
And Dickens didn't always go for the happy ending.
Yeah.
He wasn't a romantic novelist that, and they got married and lived happily ever after. Little Nell dies in the old curiosity shop. He wasn't averse to killing people off. Young Paul Dombey dies. He slaughters him. Wept buckets when he wrote the death scene, but he wasn't out to write a romantic happy ever after novel. And so I think the original ending is in many ways true to Dickens as a novelist. And perhaps even true to the characters.
But it's interesting that he was open to changing it.
Yeah.
And that we now have the two. It's not a secret that one replace the other. It's just they're both out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not many
Yeah.
books can probably say that about us, I suppose.
That's
No.
right. There are so many
But even in the second ending, all Dickens says is, "I saw no shadow of another parting from her," and that's it.
Make of it with what you will.
Yeah.
He's being as enigmatic as Jaggers in that. In that
Yeah.
Yes.
We've seen so many television and movie versions of this book. Has anyone seen one that really captures this novel? I've struggled, I must admit.
The one that I remember always, my father always remembers John Mills. You know,
Yeah.
that was the one. But from my childhood, it was Sarah Miles and Michael York, and that's the one that I always think of when I think of Great Expectations. But I think some of the more recent ones have been very good. The one with Ralph Fiennes and Helena Bonham Carter I thought was excellent. There was a dreadful one with Gwyneth Paltrow and Ethan Hawke and Anne Bancroft, which was just awful, set in America. What do you think, Letitia? What's yours favourite?
I have to say I've never found a good version. I thought Ralph Fiennes played Magwitch really well. I hated the Gillian Anderson as Miss Havisham version. They changed so much of the text, and the thing that I cherish and love about this book is the incredible writing in it, and I hate when they just sort of make up and tear apart, this beautiful text for no reason other than, because it was an actual miniseries, so they could have, invested a bit more time.
Yeah.
So I have to admit with this one that I've never found a version that I can say I've loved.
Well, I'm old enough that I grew up with the David Lean version with John Mills, and Martita Hunt as Miss Havisham, I think, is just wonderful. And I've never found another film or program that bettered that. That's my benchmark for it. And it was interesting that the recent British Film Festival here in Sydney, the 5 top films of all time voted for, 3 of them were David Lean films. And I think he was a good filmmaker.
Do we think that this is Dickens' best book? It's often touted as such. That's a controversial one for you, Jeff. What do you think?
I'm going to pass on that. I don't.
Come on.
The Tale of Two Cities is probably my favourite of all the books. But best, I'm not going to pass a view on that.
What about you, Louise?
Well, because it was my first Dickens, it has a very, very special spot. It's just those characters and the word pictures that he creates was just an eye-opener. I will always love Great Expectations. A very close second for me would have to be Christmas Carol. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful book. But every time I read a Dickens afresh, I just think, wow, I think I've got another new favourite. So they still keep coming. But, yeah, Great Expectations is something special. And often if people ask me what is the first Dickens to start with, I would say Great Expectations.
Definitely. It's easy to read too, because I've just read The Old Curiosity Shop, and I found that a bit of a chore. It was written 20 years before Great Expectation, but like David Copperfield, it's written in the first person. It's beautifully written, and I just couldn't put it down.
Well, I think we all agree that this was definitely one of our favourite book club books.
Oh, yeah.
I'd really like to thank everyone for joining us today for Penguin Book Club. And our next book will be William Thackeray's Vanity Fair. So I'm really looking forward to chatting about that, and that's going to be on the 19th of June. Thank you so much, Fred, Louise, Sarah, and Jeff for joining us for Penguin Book Club today.
Thank you.
And for everyone out there who's watching, we look forward to seeing you next book club. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.